Noam Chomsky, Who Rules the World? Dive into the intricate web of global power dynamics with Noam Chomsky's Who Rules the World? This penetrating exploration unveils the gripping tales of two infamous September 11 THS, the US-backed coup in Chile in 1973 and the tragic terrorist attacks in 2001, and exposes the dualities that shape American foreign policy. Chomsky delves into the unsettling influence of multinational corporations and financial elite, who wield their power to steer political agendas away from public interests and towards their own profit. This summary also highlights the erosion of fundamental rights and the looming threats like climate change and nuclear proliferation, posing existential risks to the planet. Through these thought-provoking themes, Chomsky challenges the notion of who truly governs, urging readers to question the status quo and consider the broader implications for humanity as a whole.
Dual Faces of September 11. On two separate September 11 THS, the United States showcased drastically different approaches to foreign policy, revealing a profound duality in its global strategies. First, journey back to September 11, 1973, when a US-endorsed military coup in Chile led to the demise of President Salvador Allende's democratically elected government. This brutal overthrow was not an isolated incident but part of a broader U.S. campaign to stifle communism and radical movements across Latin America during the Cold War. Fear of destabilization prompted the U.S. to enhance Latin American military forces under the guise of counterinsurgency, birthing paramilitary death squads infamous for their severe human rights violations in Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Argentina. Fast forward to September 11, 2001, when Al-Qaeda's atrocious attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon resulted in the tragic loss of nearly 3,000 lives. The ensuing war on terror, spearheaded by President Bush, saw invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, echoing the relentless military interventions of the past. These engagements unleashed exceptional human and financial expenses, edging nearly into the realm of strategy missteps that Osama bin Laden might have anticipated. Analysts like former CIA officer Michael Scheuer argued that the U.S.'s aggressive stance played into bin Laden's hands, illustrating a cycle of violence and widespread destabilization. These two September 11 THS underscore a striking inconsistency within U.S. foreign policy, a divergence between the ideals of promoting democracy and the cold calculations of maintaining global influence. Depending on strategic needs, the U.S. has either supported democratic movements or endorsed authoritarian regimes, toggling between exaltation and suppression with a disturbing fluidity. This contradiction unveils a fundamental double standard where actions often pivot not on moral principles but on strategic interests. The narratives woven around these days of September expose a nation's complex legacy, grappling with its identity as a harbinger of democracy and a relentless enforcer of strategic dominance. Double standards of power. When discussing global affairs, what does the world truly mean? Consider the assassination of Imad Mughniyeh, a high-ranking Hezbollah military leader, in February 2008. Although celebrated in Western media as justice served, the celebration reveals a narrow perspective. While headlines claimed the world supported this act, they referred mainly to political and media figures in Washington and London, not the broader global populace. The case of Mughniyeh serves as a lens to view how narratives are shaped. Often, they fail to capture the whole truth. A poignant example is Mughniyeh's role in hijacking the Aquila Loro, resulting in the tragic murder of Leon Klinghoffer. The media reaction was one of universal condemnation, yet this incident was itself a desperate response to an earlier Israeli strike on Tunis, an attack unnoticed by many. Such acts of reciprocal violence show the complexity often omitted in media portrayals. More tragic events unfolded that same year. In Beirut, a CIA-backed car bombing targeted Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, killing 80 civilians, mostly women and girls. The operation failed to hit its mark and was conspicuously absent from terrorism labels commonly reserved for less destructive acts. Similarly, Israeli military operations in southern Lebanon, claiming 20,000 lives and leaving Beirut shattered, escaped the terrorism tag. This bias is a stark example of how violence is perceived based on who is behind it. The terminology used to describe violence carries weight. Acts by non-state groups like Hezbollah are readily called terrorism. Yet, when state powers like the US or Israel carry out similar actions, they are often classified under less incriminating terms, avoiding the stigma of terrorism. Three categories define culpability: murder with intent, accidental casualties, and foreseen but unintended killings. While terrorist acts are slotted into the first category, state actions frequently find refuge in the latter categories, stripping them of moral condemnation. Invoking the world serves as a tactical maneuver for Anglo-American authorities to defend their strategies, but their omnipresent gaze might provoke more fear globally than the insurgents they target. In reality, for much of the world, the unchecked dominance of these governments is a far greater terror than the militants they vilify. This narrative manipulation, cloaked as objectivity, artfully maintains their interests, often blurring the boundary between ethical justification and strategic power play. Masters of influence. Who wields true power across the globe? Beyond nation-states, it's the multinational corporations and colossal financial institutions that dictate the rules. Adam Smith once called them the masters of mankind, and they continue to dominate, shaping the world's political landscape in profound ways. In the 20th century, philosopher John Dewey observed that as long as politics remains overshadowed by big business, no amount of adjustment to this shadow changes the core reality. Focusing on the influence of financial institutions on American politics reveals a clear pattern. Over recent decades, corporate power has steadily nudged both main political parties in the U.S. further right, aligning their agendas more closely with those of major banks rather than the populace. Consider the reaction to the 2008 financial crisis. While the American public prioritized tackling unemployment, political leaders, swayed by financial clout, chose to zero in on reducing the national deficit, desires that were clearly not echoed by the public. Remarkably, 72% of Americans supported taxing the super-wealthy to address the deficit, but financial leaders had different plans. President Obama's administration responded by bailing out Wall Street and enacting a modest stimulus package, a stark shift away from popular demand. Meanwhile, funding for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the watchdog of Wall Street, saw heavy cuts, benefiting the financial sector by limiting oversight. This misalignment between public need and government action wasn't a new development, rather, it had been gaining momentum since the 1970s, marked by offshoring, reduced capital controls, and the sell of free market ideology which calls for deregulation and minimal government intervention. As wealth concentration grew, so did the need for politicians to rely on campaign contributions from affluent interests, further entwining political agendas with corporate priorities. The enduring system sees today's masters, the financial institutions and multinational giants, pursue short-term gains, often at societal expense. Citigroup exemplifies this, viewing the world as divided into two groups, the ultra-wealthy plutonomy and the economically vulnerable global precariat. Citigroup's advice to investors to capitalize on the plutonomy has proven lucrative. Companies that profit from wealth disparity have outpaced broader market performance for decades. As long as these dynamics stay in play, the chasm between the plutonomy and the global precariat will only widen. Rights and wrongs of commons. Imagine a world where the king isn't above the law. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, brought this revolutionary concept into reality. This ancient document laid the groundwork for modern legal systems by introducing principles that have reverberated throughout history. Among its most pivotal contributions, the Magna Carta introduced habeas corpus, a safeguard against unlawful detention, and the Charter of the Forest, which protected the rights of common people to resources like forests and rivers. Such ideals have inspired many constitutions, including that of the United States. However, these rights are under constant threat. The right to communal resources, or commons, is frequently overshadowed by the ambitions of governments and corporations keen on privatizing assets that should belong to the public. A glaring example is when the World Bank backed a mining company's suit against El Salvador for seeking to protect its environment from destructive mining practices. Historically, this pattern of exploitation has been cloaked in legal doctrines devised by imperial powers to confiscate indigenous lands. The justification for such exploitation often lies in the tragedy of the commons, a misguided belief that shared resources are doomed to overuse when individuals act solely out of self-interest. Yet, the work of Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom and others reveals the opposite. Local communities can manage resources like fish stocks and water more sustainably than large corporations. Similarly, colonial powers weaponized the doctrine of terra nullius, which falsely claimed that lands belonged to no one, to usurp indigenous territories and dispossess native populations. The true tragedy of the commons stems from exploitation by commercial and colonial forces rather than the misuse by those who rely on them for survival. In parallel, the right enshrined in habeas corpus has been degraded over time. The U.S. Constitution, though embracing the Magna Carta's promise against unlawful punishment, tragically excluded enslaved individuals from its definition of free men. The Three-Fifths Compromise further dehumanized black people, and even post-slavery, vagrancy laws perpetuated racial oppression. Yet, amidst these injustices, the Magna Carta stands as a beacon, reminding us of enduring principles of justice and equality. While powerful entities continue to find loopholes to limit our freedoms and usurp collective resources, the essence of the Magna Carta endures, championing the rights of all individuals to justice and fair treatment. 3 minutes to midnight. Imagine a clock that doesn't tell time but instead warns of looming global threats. This doomsday clock is set by scientists to symbolize how close humanity is to catastrophe. In 2015, its hands rested at 3 minutes to midnight, driven by risks of climate change and nuclear annihilation. As glaciers melt, rising seas threaten to swallow cities such as New York and Mumbai, yet international climate agreements, like the 2015 Paris Agreement undermined by the U.S., remain inadequate and mostly voluntary. The nuclear threat casts an equally dark shadow. History has teetered on the edge of nuclear disaster, like in 1983, when Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov averted a potential war by dismissing a false alarm of incoming U.S. missiles. Despite such narrow escapes, nuclear arsenals continue to expand, with countries like North Korea enhancing their capabilities. Decisions on both climate and nuclear matters stem more from power struggles than true global security. In a world ruled by a network of nations, corporations, and elites, the quest for personal gain overshadows public safety. It's imperative that we steer the world away from this perilous path, for the responsibility to reshape our future lies with us all.
In Who Rules the World, Noam Chomsky presents a compelling critique of the forces directing global affairs, pinpointing the contradiction between the public narratives of democracy and the reality of power politics. The book underscores the manipulative practices that uphold corporate interests over societal welfare, revealing how these practices are often cloaked under the guise of combating terrorism or promoting economic growth. By examining historical and contemporary events, Chomsky highlights the disparities in who benefits from global governance and the pernicious consequences of such inequality. As lucrative elites and nation-states maintain their dominance, the book asserts that the path toward a fairer world demands vigilance and activism from ordinary citizens. This summary encapsulates these central themes, urging a re-examination of who truly rules our world and for whom the system is designed.